On July 4, 2025, a phone call between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky sent shockwaves through the world. The conversation, which began as a routine diplomatic check-in, quickly escalated into something far more consequential. As the two leaders spoke, the fate of the ongoing war in Ukraine, and perhaps the stability of Europe itself, hung in the balance. The world's media scrambled to decipher the implications, while intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic listened in, aware that history might be unfolding in real time. In a move that stunned even his closest advisors, Trump asked Zelensky if, with the advanced U.S. weaponry now in Ukraine's arsenal, the Ukrainian military could, and would, strike deep into Russian territory. He specifically named Moscow and St. Petersburg, Russia's most iconic and heavily defended cities. The question was bold, almost unthinkable, and it immediately raised the stakes of the conflict to a new level. This marked a dramatic break from previous U.S. policy, which had always stopped short of endorsing attacks inside Russia's borders. For years, American leaders had carefully avoided crossing this line, fearing that any direct assault on Russian soil could trigger a catastrophic confrontation between NATO and Russia. The old rules were clear: support Ukraine, but don't provoke Moscow into a wider war. But Trump's question wasn't a direct order. Instead, it was a test. A way to gauge Ukraine's resolve and to send a powerful, unmistakable signal to the Kremlin. Was the United States now willing to escalate, to rewrite the rules of engagement, and to risk a broader conflict? The message was clear: the old boundaries might no longer apply. The very idea of targeting Russia's core cities with American-supplied arms crossed a red line that had held since the Cold War. In diplomatic circles, alarm bells rang. Allies and adversaries alike wondered if the world was on the brink of a new, more dangerous era, one where the unthinkable could become reality. Trump's move reflected not just his growing frustration with the war's grinding stalemate, but also his willingness to challenge decades of established policy. The conflict had dragged on, with neither side able to claim decisive victory. For Trump, the time for half measures was over. He was ready to take risks, to force a breakthrough, even if it meant venturing into uncharted and perilous territory. Was this a calculated bluff designed to force Putin's hand at the negotiating table, or a reckless gamble that could push the conflict into dangerous new territory? Analysts debated whether Trump was playing a high-stakes game of psychological warfare, or if he was truly prepared to see the conflict escalate beyond anything seen in decades. As news of the call spread, the world was left to wonder if this was the start of a new, riskier phase in the war. Governments convened emergency meetings, citizens watched anxiously, and the specter of a wider conflict loomed over Europe and beyond. The stakes had never been higher, and the next moves by Trump, Zelensky, and Putin would shape the future of the region and perhaps the world. Zelensky's response to Trump was swift and clear, leaving no room for ambiguity. In a matter of hours, he addressed the world's media, making it evident that Ukraine would not be intimidated or sidelined by shifting international rhetoric. His words were measured, but the intent behind them was unmistakable: a leader determined to defend his nation's sovereignty at any cost. Zelensky stated that if Ukraine were given the necessary weapons, it could strike deep into Russian territory, including Moscow and St. Petersburg. This was not an idle threat, but a calculated assertion of Ukraine's growing military capability and resolve. The mention of these iconic Russian cities was deliberate, signaling that Ukraine was prepared to escalate the conflict if pushed further. This wasn't just about demonstrating military strength, it was a strategic message to both allies and adversaries. Zelensky wanted the world to understand that Ukraine was not simply defending itself, but was also willing to take bold action to deter further aggression. The statement was a warning, but also a plea for support, highlighting the stakes of the ongoing war. After years of relentless Russian attacks that have devastated Ukrainian cities and displaced millions, Zelensky's affirmation marked a significant shift. It signaled a willingness to shift the pain and consequences of war back onto Russia itself, making clear that Ukraine would not remain a passive victim. In his discussions with Western leaders, Zelensky emphasized that the only thing holding Ukraine back from escalating its response was Western restraint, not a lack of Ukrainian will or capability. He underscored that Ukraine's hands were tied by the limitations imposed by its allies, not by any hesitation on its own part. This put significant pressure on Washington and other Western capitals to reconsider their policies. Zelensky's words forced them to confront a difficult question. How far were they willing to go in supporting Ukraine, and at what cost? The decision was no longer just about military aid, but about the future of European security. Zelensky's stance marked a turning point in the conflict, showing that Kiev would no longer accept a contained or limited war. Instead, Ukraine was prepared to expand the battlefield if necessary, refusing to let its fate be dictated by external powers or by Russian aggression. In the end, Zelensky reminded the world that Ukraine's fight is existential. For Ukrainians, this is a struggle for survival, freedom, and the right to determine their own future. All options, he made clear, are on the table, and the world is now watching to see what comes next. As news of the call broke, the White House scrambled to contain the fallout. Trump publicly clarified that he wasn't urging strikes on Moscow, nor was the U.S. actively considering such long-range missile transfers. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt insisted Trump's question was hypothetical, not a directive. The administration tried to project strength while avoiding the image of reckless escalation. This careful messaging aimed to reassure allies and avoid provoking Russia further. The distinction between asking and ordering became the administration's shield. Still, the question itself had already changed the strategic landscape. Even without action, the mere suggestion signaled a new level of American frustration and risk. The phone call was just one sign of Trump's new, tougher approach to Russia. After years of accusations that he was too soft on Moscow, Trump's recent actions have taken many by surprise. His administration has shifted gears, moving from cautious diplomacy to a far more aggressive posture. This change has sent shockwaves through Washington and across the globe, signaling a dramatic departure from his earlier policies. On July 14, he announced a major military aid package for Ukraine, including advanced weapons and more Patriot missile systems. This package, one of the largest yet, is designed to bolster Ukraine's defenses and send a clear message to the Kremlin. The move was widely interpreted as a direct challenge to Russian aggression, and it marked a significant escalation in U.S. involvement in the conflict. This time, Trump insisted European NATO allies foot the bill, increasing pressure on both Moscow and Europe. He argued that the burden of defending Ukraine should be shared, and that Europe must step up to confront the threat from Russia. This demand has sparked intense debate among NATO members, some of whom worry about the alliance's unity and future direction. He also threatened 100% secondary tariffs on any country trading with Russia if a peace deal wasn't reached in 50 days. These proposed tariffs would not only target Russia, but also any nation that continues to do business with Moscow, dramatically raising the stakes for global trade. The threat is unprecedented in its scope and could have far-reaching consequences for the world economy. This economic threat could force nations like China and India to choose between the US and Russia. For countries that rely on both American and Russian markets, the decision could reshape alliances and global power dynamics. Diplomats are scrambling to assess the potential fallout as leaders weigh the risks of defying Washington or alienating Moscow. Trump's frustration with Putin was now public as he lamented failed diplomacy and ongoing violence. In recent interviews, he has openly criticized the Russian president, accusing him of breaking promises and escalating the conflict. This public rift marks a stark contrast to their earlier, more cordial relationship, and it has fueled speculation about the future of US-Russia ties. The combination of military escalation and economic warfare marked a new, confrontational chapter. Analysts warned that this dual strategy could provoke unpredictable responses from Moscow, potentially drawing the US and its allies deeper into the conflict. The world is watching closely as tensions continue to rise on multiple fronts. The stakes for US-Russia relations had never been higher. With both sides digging in, the possibility of a diplomatic breakthrough seems more remote than ever. As the world braces for what comes next, the consequences of Trump's hardline stance are only beginning to unfold. Moscow took Trump's threats seriously. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov called the developments very serious, signaling real concern. Russia's response was measured, not inflammatory. They needed time to analyze the situation. The threat of secondary tariffs, more than military escalation, posed a grave risk to Russia's economy. If enforced, these tariffs could isolate Russia far more than previous sanctions. The Kremlin now faced a choice: escalate further or seek a diplomatic off-ramp. Moscow's cautious reaction showed it was weighing its options carefully. The world watched to see if this pressure would break the stalemate or spark greater danger. Despite the rising stakes, Russia's demands for peace remained unchanged and uncompromising. Moscow insisted on Ukraine's demilitarization, neutrality and recognition of all occupied territories, including Crimea and the Donbas. Russia also demanded full sanctions relief and legal immunity for its officials. These terms amount to Ukraine's effective surrender, an outcome Kyiv and the West cannot accept. The gulf between the sides remains vast, with little hope for compromise. Analysts like Professor Scott Lucas argue that today's crisis stems from Putin's own miscalculations. Putin underestimated Ukraine's resolve and the West's unity, expecting a quick victory and weak opposition. Instead, his invasion strengthened NATO and deepened Western support for Ukraine. Each Russian escalation has made a negotiated settlement harder, pushing leaders like Trump toward more extreme measures. The cycle of escalation is a direct result of Putin's uncompromising strategy. Trump's actions, while risky, are a response to a crisis Putin set in motion. The war in Ukraine has entered its most dangerous phase yet. The mere discussion of striking Moscow crosses a psychological threshold, raising the risk of catastrophic miscalculation. If Ukraine, with US backing, were to attack a Russian city, the Kremlin's response could be severe, potentially even nuclear. Trump's pressure campaign could force Putin to negotiate, or it could push the conflict into open war between nuclear powers. The world now faces a handful of grim scenarios, from breakthrough peace to global catastrophe. The decisions made in Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow in the coming weeks will shape the future of international security. The fate of Ukraine, and perhaps the world, hangs in the balance.